in a very well manner compared to us as normal people. Politicians get to send their kids to very good and expensive school. But what about the normal society? They only get to attend normal schools, in which is because they couldn't afford. Politicians are being treated in good hospitals. They are being given good services in hospitals. But what about the normal society? They are being treated in a different way. Politicians receive good doctors, but what about us as normal people? We don't. Therefore, the problem of this debate is, number one, the state-owned service. For example, like the public transportation, the healthcare focusing more on hospitals, both private and government hospitals, focusing also on public housing, and focusing on clinics. The problem to this issue is that all these state-owned services are often neglected. Why is this often neglected? Is because these politicians and these relatives of politicians, they do not use this. They are being treated in a different way, therefore they are being served in a greater manner compared to us. These state-owned services are often neglected and they are given very, very poor service. The government saved a lot of cost, which also results into all these state-owned services being neglected. The cost that is being saved by the government are being used for unnecessary expenses. And therefore, the politicians, they do not conceive that the quality is bad and being neglected. So we believe that the poor quality can be treated better. And the other thing is also that the education system is also very bad. We are being exposed to an education system that is not as improvised as these politician kids. These politician kids get an update in their education system. Therefore, they are being exposed to different things to be learned. And therefore, this at the same point improvise the life of these politician kids to move forward, and they are being exposed to greater things in life compared to us. We have the ability to do so, but the thing that is pushing us is the services that we are receiving, the services that is supposed to be given in a better manner, the services that we are supposed to deserve, which is equivalent to the politician of these kids. The second point is that these poor people, they have no choice. These poor people, they have no choice to consent to other things, but it's just that they have to use all these public services which is being given by the government. They have no space to point out their point of view, and it's because that if they point out their point of view, they are being treated as disrespectful, or the politician might say that you are being very ungrateful towards things that we provide. But the thing is that all these state-owned services are not being updated. They are being reused over and over and over again. But these politicians, they receive things that is being updated almost all the time. These poor people, they don't know how much better can all these state-owned services get. And the only thing they can do is that they depend on the government. Because of the power and the standard that they are standing in, they lift up all their beliefs and hopes to the government. But the thing that is very disappointing is that politicians, they do not improvise all these state-owned services. And therefore, the poor people, the only chance they have to receive is that they have to reuse these items over and over again, even though they are disappointed and even though they do not have the right to stand up for their point of view. The model for the debate is that we require all politicians to all politicians to only exclusively use state-owned services. It is a must for them to use all state-owned services, and they are not supposed to use any private services. And for this to happen, these politicians will be monitored through documentations, through the news and everything. They are always being monitored. Therefore, they cannot lie, and they cannot find any reasons. They cannot find any reasons to use any private items, but they definitely have to use all state-owned services. For example, the politicians, they would have to be treated in general hospitals, which is also equivalent to where society use, and they would have to stay in public housing areas. For example, like Halima, the president of Singapore, stays at the HBD flat. And the second point is that immediate nuclear family is also tied to rules requirement to have to subscribe. For example, the kids of politicians, they would have to attend public schools, and they are not allowed to attend any other private schools or being given any exclusive education, which is completely in a different level compared to kids from normal families. And if they don't, they are found to if they are being found to subscribe to private items, therefore we are willing to strip them of their position of power and reward them to another person, for example, like the member of parliament. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we think that definitely it is a time to make a change. It is a time to make a change, and therefore we have to make a difference so that we will not repeat the same mistake over and over again, which at the same point will improvise both the politicians and the society, and at the same time make the country a better place. Thank you.
Here. Okay, I invite the deputy chair to open the case for opposition. Here. Oh shit.
Good here.
Forcing politicians to use state-owned services will not be incentive to better these state-owned services. Instead, it will be abused as a smokescreen to do nothing for your country. Before I move on with my arguments, I would like to rebut the speaker before me. So, the side government said that the reason the state-owned services are very bad is because you don't use it, right? Because we think this is a huge exaggeration, because we think there are many incentives for politicians to suffer to better the state facilities. Like, the first reason to this is that you get favor from the public so that they can be re-elected the next term. Secondly, to obtain donations for their campaign. And thirdly, most politicians want to have great political legacy, and therefore want to be supported by their country. And therefore, we think that it's a lie for them to actually say that these state-owned services will never get better under our side, because it will prove, and I will prove later in my second argument, why there will be less incentives to fix these state-owned services. My first argument: what do side opposition support? Firstly, politicians, like every other citizens, will have the choice to use either public or private services for themselves or their families. Why is that? The first argument: why is there no principal obligation for them to only use public services? Firstly, we think that every citizen of a country is given the choice to choose what kind of facilities they want to, and it could be based on their firstly personal preferences and financial capabilities, or maybe their own convenience. In the same way, we do not force citizens to use specific facilities such as this. We don't think it's fair to actually impose this burden on a politician itself. And second reason to this analysis is that politicians should be able to use the best facilities, even if these facilities are not in the public sector. Why do we think so? We think politicians face a bigger responsibilities to their country as compared to an average citizen, and often the way our economy and legislation and your entire country is run is handled by the hands of these politicians. We think that the harm in this is that in the instances that these politicians are not able to carry out their job effectively, cannot carry their duties effectively, we think that the entire country would suffer. We think that this is very harmful while to sit down. And for example, we think if a politician falls sick and they think that they think that it's better for them to be cured in a private hospital, but because they have to be in a public hospitals as what they're told to, they cannot run their country and run their job effectively. And second reason for this analysis is that we think that politicians are often in a more grave danger than an average citizen in the country itself. For example, like they're exposed to terrorist attacks, they're exposed to riots, they're exposed to all these assassinations and stuff, because face it, they're actually a public figure, and this means that often public services cannot effectively provide the protection and security that these politicians need. And the conclusion to all of this is because of the unique positions that politicians have, they need to have access to the best facilities, even if facilities are privately owned. And second argument, why will the improvement of public facilities worsen under side government? We think that the first reason of this is that politicians will only use the best of public facilities. These facilities are often found in urban areas, such as cities or rich suburban, and such as your school or like your best public hospitals, etc. And what's the harm of all of this? We think that in government's best case scenario, in which politicians now have the incentive to make the state facilities a lot better, we think that they will only be incentivized to make the facilities better, and rich areas like cities and suburbans will get these benefits, but not these rural and small areas other than the big areas. And secondly, the public sit down. The public loses the ability to claim victimhood. And what does this mean? This means that under side government, politicians can now claim that public facilities are good because they themselves have went to these state-owned services. And what this means is it's harder for the public to actually claim that politicians are not improving the country when these politicians themselves can act as a first-hand witness to the state of the facilities. Before I move on, any PI? Okay.
So oftentimes politicians are situated in the areas that they choose to represent, which is to say that even the most rural areas will have politicians living there as well. So why don't they present an important force when it comes to the improvement of public facilities?
No, we still think that even if they're placed in that way, in those areas, they will still go to the best public services that's available for them. They will not just go to this rural areas that they think is not even good for them. So yeah, I don't think that POI actually makes sense. So as a conclusion to this, we think that this will be a greater divide between rich and rural areas, and it'll also be harder to hold politicians accountable for their own poor state facilities. With that, go with side opposition.
Okay, I'd like to thank the leader of the opposition for his remarks and invite the Deputy Prime Minister to stand. Here.
Panel, it's absolutely hilarious how opposition thinks that the incentive for re-election is enough of a check and balance mechanism that exists in society for politicians to try and make people as happy as possible. If this is the case, panel, we think there'll be no such thing as unhappy citizens because every politician will have that incentive in their mind and will do their best. We don't necessarily think that's the case. In my speech, I'll do two things to you. Number one, I'll talk to you through the process as to how these facilities will receive the betterment that we claim to have in opening government. We'll also tell you why the trade-off of the lives of luxury that these politicians can live is completely justified from opening government. But we'll also talk to you on a new idea about how there is a social gap that exists between individuals on the ground and politicians that exist. And this luxury is literally the reason why individuals on the ground don't feel like they can trust in politicians, don't feel like they can trust in the politics as a whole, right? Before I talk to you about the two substantives in my speech, a couple of responses to the ridiculous assertions in the speaker before me. Firstly, on the incentive for re-election, because they told us that politicians can still now try and go to these public services or these state-run services because they want to try and seem as politicians that care about individuals on the ground. A couple of problems with this, because here's what's going to happen inside of opposition. They don't understand that individuals on the ground don't necessarily have the information or don't know how much better these services can become. Why is this the problem? Because we argue to you from opening government that politicians are the only individuals that are privy to the specific knowledge of knowing how much better a particular private or state-run facility can be better. How many more doctors can we actually afford for this particular clinic? How much better can this public housing become rather than just having tokenistic policies to make things better? In a world where these particular politicians go to these state-run services and become literal immediate beneficiaries, this is the world where they would want to maximize the margin of betterment for these particular facilities because they are literally the beneficiaries of the system and they would want to benefit from as much development as possible. Realizing that they benefit themselves in the process is the best form of incentive and check and balance mechanism so that these kinds of services become as good as they can. In their world, politicians will lie to you. They will say that we are already doing enough. In fact, there are greater state priorities that we have to cater to. We'll make things marginally better, but not as better as they can be. You let politicians get away with keeping this money for personal luxuries. You get politicians getting away with things like tax evasion, etc. And our world, we reduce that, we get better facilities. But the next thing, it is a ridiculous thing to justify why these individuals can have luxury, is the idea of how they're public figures and they are more prone to be attacked by terrorists. If that's the case, we argue to you, don't become a freaking politician, right? Because we argue to you, when you become a politician, you consent to placing the priorities of the lives of individuals on the ground before yours. If that is the world that we live in and we think that you get lesser politicians because they fear that their lives are at stake or they get they fear that they might be attacked by terrorists, etc., we don't think becoming a politician, we don't think becoming a politician is the job for you. We are okay with trading you off. But the next thing they told us is how under our world, politicians will go to the best form of public services available and will not stay and go to the less developed public services that exist. At the very least, even in our world, if these politicians go to say the hospital in Kuala Lumpur and don't go to the one in Hulu Langat or in some rural area, on a net, we still get a better public service in some area. In fact, we argue to you that there are incentives for the rural areas to also better, right? The fact that the politicians are still geographically further away means that it's directly convenient for these politicians to better the services that are closer to them, right? We think there is still, on a net, more incentives under our world for these services to become better. Argumentations. Firstly, on how the process of betterment of facilities exists. What is the existing mechanism in their world? Because they tell us that individuals can still complain about these things and can make the world better. Why does this not work? Because even if in their world, individuals on the ground are unhappy with the services and facilities they get, which we argue maybe is not the case because they are shrouded by state propaganda, if they complain in their world, two possible things can happen. Number one, their complaints are brushed off because they are said that the state has better priorities to give to, or in the best case scenario in their world, they will receive tokenistic forms of reparation or a betterment in their world. This looks like adding just another doctor to a particular clinic, or fixing the tiles outside of a particular clinic, or building a stupid park in the public housing area as opposed to literally bettering the facilities within public housing, right? This is the kind of tokenistic and retarded development that you get in their world because of the fact that politicians aren't the immediate beneficiaries for this, right? You don't get ridiculous welfare policies like Malaysia's Adam 50, where they give you 200 ringgit for having a child. You get actual policies that are better for you. The trade-off is justified because we think that when you become a politician, you choose to place the life of the average citizen on the ground before you. The more reflective your life is of the average citizen on the ground, the more incentive for you to better that life. We argue to you that that consent is valid, and we think it trickles down to this. But next on this argument about like the social gap between politicians and people on the ground, because we need to understand there's one premise that we have to agree. The more similar the life of another person is to you, the more inclined I am to believe in you, the more inclined I am to believe in the things and the values that you hold, right? So in our world, when the individuals are the ones that are taking public transportation, when you see your member of parliament in the bus, when you see them in the tram, when you're going to certain areas on a day-to-day basis, that's when you realize that this politician is living your life. That's when you have more faith in knowing that this person is going to represent your values, is going to represent the betterment of your society first. Why is this important? Because we argue to you that people who don't believe in their politicians are inclined to keep their struggles to themselves because they don't have faith in the system and they think that they are not valid, that the struggles that they have is not valid. Or in the best case scenario, they do talk about these problems, but they talk about this ironically in certain spaces that don't necessarily translate to changes or policies. Under our world, when you have individuals and when you have these politicians living their life, we think like the fact that like their privilege and the luxury that they live, or their political power that is now seen as authoritative and causes people to not believe in them, does not exist anymore. They live your average citizen lives, and as a result, you're more inclined to believe in them. You're more inclined to talk about your problems to the member of parliament in your local constituency. You're more inclined to push for policies. You're more inclined to like literally just at the very least make like the members of parliament in your certain areas cognizant of the issues that they have. At the very least, in our world, you don't have state propaganda shrouding the rationality of individuals on the ground. You don't have subpar facilities being given to society when the state literally has the ability to provide better facilities. It is unethical for the state to withhold these kinds of resources. And we argue to you as a politician, you are the channel, you are the vessel, you are the conduit between the state and the person on the ground, and you have to maximize this particular role, and you have to ensure that the individuals on the ground receive the best kinds of facilities possible. If the world that you're talking about is a world where individuals live looking up at politicians like celebrities, that is the same world that you have lesser individuals believing in the system, lesser individuals wanting change, and lesser individuals being able to get the change that they desire.
Here, I would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister and invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition to speak. Also like to remind all of you that it would behoove you to ask KYs in your speeches. All right, on that note, Deputy Leader of Opposition, please take a stand.
Here.
Oh, he just talked, right? This is not a mic. Not a mic.
I mean,
the logic on the side government is that states lie, and because they lie, they can get away with not bettering certain public facilities and state care. What I do not understand the side government is why that these lies won't be even more reinforced when you as a politician can say, oh, I actually entered this public school, I actually use these public hospitals, and they're really great. I have no idea why you're complaining because I am just like you, I have suffered just like you, but at the same time, I don't think that there's any harm to the facilities that I have provided. I think under side government's world, the ability for the public to gain victimhood is a lot less. I think that's a harm that worsens the country even more. In my argument today, I will only bring to you one more thing as to why politics restructured to become a bad platform for structural change to occur, because you disincentivize politicians within rural areas to run for office. But before that, two main issues in responses. First thing, the biggest contention that came under side government was that people don't know how much better public state care can be and how much better hospitals and schools can become. It only happens under side government. The first response is, I have no idea why this is true. They do not tell us why letting politicians use the best state care within their country means that suddenly people within rural areas can finally know that my hospital can be as good as that. They do not explain how that transfer of information
information that can actually happen. But let's use the logic that came under both speakers, right? Because they wanted to say that governments will lie, and because they lie, they will not actually better the economy. Now we think that the debate has to become, in which world will this lie be a lot stronger and become a lot more believable? This is when Farah, in her argument, already explicitly say that because you can claim yourself as a member of society, one that is just on par with them, and the person that has gone through the same kind of suffering as every other citizen, that's when they can easily start the lie that state care is not that bad, because they can also claim that victimhood also. The conclusion to this is, number one, they did not prove why there is a transfer of information and how poor people within rural areas would suddenly realize that I can get better state care facilities. But secondly, we think the lies that governments tell will become a lot more believable when the public themselves, when the politicians themselves can obtain the same level of victimhood. The second issue, take a seat, I'll take you later. Right? The second issue response is the idea that state care becomes better under their world. That's their biggest benefit. Let's use two points of their logic. Because the first thing they want to say is that some politicians are very corrupt and they're very evil, like take a lot of money, all that, blah, 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 right? Then I do not know why, if it is true that these politicians are mean and they're corrupt and they will do anything for their money, then why is it that they would use their entire country's budget to restructure an entire healthcare system or entire education system if it is true that they are corrupt and they want to obtain this kind of money? If they know, and if it's true that these politicians are evil and they want to obtain as much money as possible, then I don't see why they would want to spend that money restructuring the entire economy or the entire infrastructure. I think what they are more likely to do, because they are evil and because now they're more desperate to keep that money, is that they're more likely to, as Farah already explained, to lie about certain things, or just use the best form of state care, move their child from a rural area to a more privileged private school, or use the best hospitals available. So I don't think that it is true that politicians are evil and corrupt, that they would immediately want to choose to restructure an entire country. Take a seat. But I'm going to say in some cases, and I think actually a few, there's some developing countries that the reason why certain public facilities are good is because they don't have resources to make it better, because they are poor, because they don't have enough resources. Maybe they cannot add in more doctors because there are no doctors within their economy, because they don't have better schools or medical schools to actually create really good doctors, or they don't have money to subsidize public education and all that. I think this is quite true in some developing countries, and we have to consider that maybe not all governments are evil, simply that they're doing the best that they can, but their best is maybe kind of shit, right? What does this mean? We think what happens under their world, when you have a limited pool of resources, of doctors and education subsidies, all that, we think politicians would then be incentivized to restructure state care to benefit only themselves. That means they're going to take the best doctors within rural areas and move it to their privileged areas so that all their relatives that live around there can benefit from good doctors. They're going to push away all really good teachers from rural areas and put it into like more privileged schools within like cities and whatnot, so that their kids and their relatives or like the kids of their relatives would also become would also benefit from good education. That means under your world, you take away the very small amount of very good resources within rural areas and push it only to the most privileged areas within a particular state. I think under your world, it becomes a lot worse for poor people that are in need of state care. Yes.
So your logic is they want people to believe in them so they will re-elect them. But then the same line of logic you will argue after that is that they will leave their voter bases in rural areas to go to city areas. Why is this the case?
No, the first thing is that if they were to, at this point when they become very desperate and they know that all their relatives would suffer, or they will lose their majority from within their city that they live in, and that the people within rich areas will no longer vote for them if they don't provide really good state care, that's when they have more of an incentive to move the small amount of resources from rural areas to more richest areas that they are in, right? My argument, why is it that politics will restructure become more? I think the first harm to this is that they disincentivize politicians within rural areas to run for office. Can I have the time? Okay, right, okay. But we think, okay, to be clear, we don't think that rich and the most privileged politicians that grew up in like maybe wealthy cities or suburban areas will not be affected by this policy, because Farah already explained to you that you can still benefit from the best form of state care facilities and still have the money and power to move good resources from rural areas to benefit them. But we think that smaller, poorer politicians that maybe are thinking of running for mayor within their own county will still face a larger barrier to entry. Why? We think under your world, they would choose not to run for office, because now they have to consider that they will be condemning their family, their extended family, the kids of that extended family into public services that may not be as good, right? Government says, like, great, I'll see that's an incentive for them to make things better if they know that's the only way to join politics. I don't think that is true, right? Because number one, your mayor of a small county will not be able to persuade an entire government to shift resources to their very small region that they represent. But secondly, it takes a lot of years to improve just a single school or a single healthcare system that a particular region follows, right? But secondly, if it is true what Pupi said, like, no, we will trade these people off even though they will have less protection and less security from all the harms that politicians are more likely to have, that is more of a reason for them to not feel safe to be a politician. They will think that the risk to be a politician is too large, and they don't want to, not only do they not want to condemn their entire family to live really worse off public facilities, but they don't want to face the fact they will receive less protection and security from things like assassination attempts, or things like they're more likely prone to terrorist attacks. All these reasons are the reasons why very poor and the less privileged politicians will not run for office, because the risk of it is way too high.
Here. All right. I'd like to invite the member of government to open up the case with the backpack. I don't know why you're here.
You're here.
Yeah, we're really very rusty. I think I will do. I'll be better tomorrow. Okay. All right, you can I get it.
I haven't muted since Mara open. Calm down, guys. What is this extension thing? So I think in the opening discussion, what we generally heard was a mishmash of potential outcomes that could happen from this particular motion. What we are going to do in closing government is prove the two core questions of debate. Firstly, we're going to explain why we think there is a principal reason why politicians ought to be compelled to only use public services, something that we don't think was provided in the opening half. And secondly, I'm going to show you actually a mechanistic process that comparatively would show you why it's more probabilistically likely it's more likely that we will end up having better public services than the opposition side. So let's first talk about the principal argumentation first. Recognize that the thing about politicians is that it's a job that is unlike any other. So in many other jobs, when you earn a lot of money, you should have the right to be able to access private services, because the idea is that you deserve that money and you deserve the luxuries that money can buy you. This is not true of politicians, because the money that politicians earn and the privilege and status that these politicians get come off of the backs of the thousands of people that are currently suffering under the kind of public good system that they are not willing to improve. Which is to say that the ability of these politicians to be able to access these private goods in the first place is literally a direct result of the job that they are doing, which was meant to be taking care of the people who are under them. And we recognize that public goods form a very important part of an everyday person's life when it comes to moving about in a city, or when it comes to taking care of their basic needs like healthcare, for example. So thank you. Then we need to recognize that if a politician is not willing to be able to take up the same public goods, the same public services that their charges are under, then we don't think that this individual has the right to access these private goods in and of itself. So the question that we must ask ourselves, therefore, is why is it that we allowing politicians who are not willing to use these public services the right to be able to access these private services in the first place, given that this clearly means that they are not actually living up to the job that they were supposed to do? Yes, Katrina.
So why is it that a politician using a private good diminishes their ability to improve public goods, or diminish the ability for a citizen to use a private or a public good?
So not that this is a distinct argument. I'm giving you a principal argument why we think they ought to do this, whereas what she's arguing is practically why it's still not okay for them to be able to do this. But the argument that we bring forward is very simple. It's just the idea that if you're responsible for public services, then you should be the kind of person
who is able or willing to take up those public services, the standard that they are at, rather than be able to side-skirt those obligations that you have in order to make life better for yourself at the expense of the individuals that are on the ground. That's the first layer of analysis that we were giving you. The second thing I want to tell you is that we would argue that as a politician, it is oftentimes very difficult for them to maintain some sort of relationship or be a good representation of the people on the ground. So we take the idea that perhaps not all politicians are completely evil. But the problem is that oftentimes, because they live a life that is so cloistered and separate from what the people on the ground necessarily live, it makes it very difficult for politicians to actually be able to accurately understand what these people want. And the problem is not that somehow a new politician can come in to be able to take over and represent them better, because oftentimes politicians come from richer backgrounds, from more privileged backgrounds, and that's the reason why they're able to ascend to politics in the first place. This means that you structurally and systemically get a world in which all of the representatives, they are trying to fight for the interests of the people, don't actually understand what it's like, for example, to have to take public transportation every day or to have to go to certain public schools. But more importantly, it also means that politicians become really bad at being able to tell people what they actually want. So this means that in a world in which they are forced to use public services, we think these politicians are much better representatives and we help them do their job better. But secondly, how do we systemically create changes in these places? The first big outcome that I want to talk about in this debate is the idea of populism. So recognize that oftentimes, lots of politicians will say things, for example, to try and get people to vote for them in a bid for them to win the elections and the like. But the problem is that they oftentimes make these promises without actually having to live through the outcomes or circumstances of things that they objectively know are bad for the people who are on the ground. So I'll give you a great example from Malaysia itself. For instance, when politicians, for example, argue that we shouldn't teach things like evolution, we should go back towards a more fundamentalist reading of the Quran, because they know that this panders to the conservative bases that exist in certain parts of the country that's able, in education systems, that would therefore vote for them. These are not the politicians that then send their own children to learn the same syllabus that they are proposing for. They are the politicians that end up sending their children overseas to places like the UK, for example, where they recognize that those forms of educational systems are more accredited and are more able to open doors for their relatives. The reason why this is important is because we recognize that these politicians know that what they're proposing is a naked attempt to get votes and has nothing whatsoever to do with the benefit of their people. But we think that the only way we can force them to take accountability for these kinds of decisions and these kinds of promises is by forcing both the politicians and the extension of themselves, like their relatives, to have to actually take on these public services themselves. So that's accountability that we're able to do. The next thing I want to talk about is how exactly, therefore, we actually create better public goods in terms of just the quality of those public goods. Now, Katrina in OO, for example, and both of them in OO, came out this really strong they want to solve. What happens if now every single politician is going to drag all of the rural, best doctors into Kuala Lumpur and then only treat the people in Kuala Lumpur? So there's a very simple response to this, which is that oftentimes politicians are spread out. You actually have to be in your constituency in that rural area to be able to run for election. No, thank you. So that means that you won't get a vast migration of the best talent to the capital city. But then she said, no. But this means that rural politicians will now no longer run, because this means that they have to live in the worst of facilities. Right. This presumes, however, that the capital city politicians have an overwhelming amount of power over the way that these resources are being distributed. But here's the difference. At the point at which we recognize that every single politician is now going to be subject to this particular policy, we need to recognize that every single representative that's in power to make decisions now has an incentive to want to improve public goods. Which is to say that it is more likely that they will pump in more money to the improvement of public goods than not. And the reason why this is good even for the most rural areas or places, for example, is because oftentimes infrastructural investments is something that trickles down. So for instance, when you get a company to improve the public transportation system within Kuala Lumpur, this oftentimes means that the areas around Kuala Lumpur, like Shah Alam, for example, or Subang, for instance, also get more interconnectedness within these areas, and oftentimes spills outwards, because that's the way they tend to work when it comes to big infrastructural projects. And it's not so easy to just manage funds such that they only specifically benefit the household that this particular politician is in. So for these reasons, we're very happy to propose.
Okay, I'd like to thank the member of government for those remarks and invite the Iron Personing CO to the stage. Here.
Daniel. Yeah, it's not. I was supposed to judge, but like they needed teams, so hey. Anyways. Yeah, let me just. Just a moment.
No problem. Take a moment to get your order. I know that's in the back half.
Yeah. Where's my paper? Where is it? Right. Right. Okay. I think it's unfair for us to just neglect a politician for being a person and wanting to benefit from their resources in order for them to perhaps get the best sort of services or perhaps wanting the best sort of education for their children because of the fact that they are politicians, which means that they in a way have already have obligations and responsibilities to the people that they've done perhaps by their policies. But other than that, it's the fact that they're a person and that they have the right to the resources that they have and that they can be able to do anything with it in the end of the day, right? So I think that's how CO will enter this debate. We will tell you how the principle of the ownership of how you've like the resources that you've gotten from the way in which you live your life is enough for you to perhaps want to use it for your own benefit in the end of the day, right? Because Sherms came out and told you that the ownership in which you have of your resources is unfair for you to use it because of the fact that you used it in the failure of your own state-owned services. And I think that more than that, right? Having to live your life constantly thinking of other people's needs above your own is already the sort of morality that you have in yourself in order for you to use your resources to have your resources to use it for your own best interest in the end of the day. Because the money that you got from these services in the end, that you've worked for your entire life, perhaps being a politician, is the most important for you to prioritize at the end of the day, right? So I think that opening opposition dealt with a few issues in their speech. Number one, on how politicians have a unique position. That's why they need more services in the in private enterprise in the end of the day, right? So I think that only prioritizing the unique position of a politician is unfair without looking at the fundamental individualistic nature of politicians in which they live their lives in the end of the day. And secondly, also they touched on the incentive of government to only improve facilities in urban areas because of the fact that these politicians usually, more often than not, only come from urban areas and just neglect people in rural areas, right? So I think the important POI that was given forward in the opening half, right, on how Shermi said that only rural areas, but then rural areas also have politicians. Why can't they have better politics in the end of the day? I think the answer to this is pretty simple, right? Because on a simple comparative between politicians in rural areas and those in urban areas is the very fact that more often than not, politicians' capital for their representation in rural areas is not as big as their political capital for those in urban areas, simply because of the fact that perhaps they're able to attend more governmental meetings, which means that they're able to meet more people in order for them to want only good things in urban areas and they only neglect the sort of politicians in rural areas just because of the fact that they are able to have the political capital that they need to further their policies, which I think government loses out in the end of the day because they're able to tell us how is it that these politicians in rural areas are able to
want to have this sort of policy changes because of the fact they don't have the political capital as much as those in rural, urban areas in the end of the day, which leads to my first argument coming from side opposition. I think I will further extend how like the solution of having politicians use state service is like problem solution mix match in the end of the day, because understand that the hierarchy of needs between people is different, right? So like state obviously has obligation to cater to everyone in a particular country, but I think that at the end of the day the prioritization is higher for those in rural areas in the end, right? So they must protect the people in those most vulnerable, because in the end of the day, these people are the ones who are unable to afford the sort of basic necessities that they want because of the fact they're low income, which means that these people are the ones who get BRIM in the end of the day, which is the Bantuan Rakyat Satu Malaysia, or perhaps having to get things like Klinik Satu Malaysia in their places. I think that this is already precedence enough for us to see that these people need the government in the end, right? So what is the reality of state-owned services? Because we can see that hospitals are crowded more often than not. Schools are overpopulated, which means that the outcome of this is that especially people in rural areas who needs these sort of services are unable to get it in the end, which means that they are unable to, they're put in wait lists, or perhaps unable to get sufficient attention for their children. So I think that the nature of politicians in the end of the day are those who are well educated and well off, which means that they are able to opt into private enterprise, which means that it gives more space for these particular people, citizens in the lower income, to opt into state-owned services, right? So what will happen if politicians and everyone opt into this already like situation? I think that in the end of the day, this in the end of the day, the problem will just be worsened because of the fact that you will have more wait lists, or you have more populated schools in the end of the day. Because understand that rural areas don't get sufficient state-owned services in the end of the day. And we think that it's places like, Kuala Pilah or Jelebu or like Sarawak rural areas where more often than not, they don't have this sort of services in the end. And I think that by having these politicians who have more political capital in rural areas opt into state-owned services, it will just like increase the sort of gap in which they get the sort of like quality of the state-owned services in the end of the day, right? So what will happen beyond this policy? But before I move on to my sure.
Yeah, so I'm really confused. If your issue is with rural facilities being bad and worsening and like politicians running away, why would people on the ground in rural areas vote for more representative politicians if they are running away?
So I think it stems from having the proper representation in the rural areas, right? It's not having that person go into the state-owned services, which I think will just shift the sort of attention or prioritization of that particular state, right? At the end of the day, so these politicians who live in city areas with like political capital that they have would now push for policy changes only on that particular place. So this shift of prioritization is particularly harmful for people who live in rural areas because of that they don't have the sort of political capital that you have in politicians in areas. So it means that you strip the sort of resources of the government to fend for people who already have like private facilities to cater to them in the end of the day. So I think that it harms the people in your rural areas more because of this shift of prioritizing that will happen in the end. So how will this likely happen, right? Because of the fact that I've already explained the whole how politicians in urban areas have more political capital, it means that they will actually hold sort of positions for them to push for these sort of changes only in that particular area and further neglect the sort of people that you want to protect as like a whole state in the end of the day. So yeah, that's all from me. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank the member off for that solution and for iron personing so that we can have debate and invite the government whip to close out the government bench.
We think that when it comes to actual politicians, that I think Sharmi has done a good job at actually establishing why exactly do they have particular duty when it comes to ensuring that people get the kind of best that they can from them. And we think that it is quite justified because especially when this aspect of the job is required of them to do this thing, especially when if they do this, then hence it will make their ability for them to do their jobs even better, hence why it is completely justified for these people to do it in the first place. But before going on to my key rebuttals, let's look at what Sharmi has told you today. Number one, she told you about the principle justification as to like why exactly is our politicians like a different job set and compared to like your normal citizens per se. This is why they actually are forced to use these particular public services and like not your normal citizens who can opt into your private or even your public in the first place, right? We think that is justified, especially when these people come into these jobs knowing that I am here for an altruistic cause, is that I'm putting people's needs first before me. Hence, this is exactly why this is in the nature of my own job. So there isn't anything exactly wrong in the first place that I'm doing. And second, when we're talking about accountability, that these politicians need to be accountable to these particular people, right? And they need to exactly know what exactly are their particular policies, even affect how exactly is it affecting these particular people. And because there is this daily interaction per se, when they themselves are going through the kind of daily lives of their own salarymen in the first place, we think that there is a better link to like them being more accountable, especially when they see these kind of people going through these things, and much more likely for them to act upon these particular policies and making sure that these infrastructures are better at the end of the day. And she also told you a bit about when it comes to like economy and how exactly like when it comes to the possibility of this particular the spreading out of this particular infrastructure to your particular rural places as a whole, right? Because of things such as how it's more cost efficient, because of how these services are usually much more likely to be dragged out of your particular like your outer KLs per se, right? That means it isn't quite centralized because it's much more cheaper for you to do this. And also because especially when your MPs in your rural areas are also requesting for the same thing to happen in their particular areas, that's why there's a much more higher likelihood for these services to be dragged out of your KLs, out of your Putrajayas in the first place, right? And we think this is much more better, right? But for sure, Kat.
Because politicians are in a unique position because of their like job, whatever, it means that they face more threats than an average citizen, it means that the country depends on them more than an average citizen. Then why do you disallow them the choice that you give to every other citizen, given that they have more of a burden to the country than an average citizen?
I think like this whole characterization of them constantly being assaulted or something, like I think this isn't particularly true, especially when it comes to like the context of Malaysia per se. We've seen certain ministers actually take public transport and they're doing quite fine. And also when it comes to security, I think that since if your normal citizens are going through dangerous situations per se, then we think that if it's unlikely for them to be in such a dangerous situation, then I'm sure that your MPs can also survive through the day, because we have people who actually take care of like your bomb squads or all these sort of things are still services that apply to your general public per se, that we have people who actually care about public security, hence it will also extend to your particular MPs, and we think that this is fine, right? And okay, let's go through like how Shah's case, right? So I think she tries to talk a lot about how the rural areas and how like your MPs are like they don't have particular political capital, and then this whole idea of them moving out to your particular urban areas. Like number one, we think that this is untrue because we think that because of the likelihood of like your rural areas having like more when it comes to problems when it comes to your public infrastructure and your services. Hence, that is why it is much more likely for them to actually collectivize and gain a bigger voice when it comes to your parliament, because they're all complaining about the same thing. Like, my bus drives are really crap, guys. Like, I'm always late to my job because the train is always late. So that means that there was much more possibility of your particular central government actually listening to these particular rural area MPs, right, in the first place, because they're all complaining about the same thing, right? And when it comes to like this whole idea of like them moving to this particular place, we think that this is also untrue, because they still need to actually stay in their constituents and do their actual job, especially when they also need things such as like they want to be liked by their actual people, right? So like if I move to your KL and like don't even talk to my particular people in that particular constituency, it means that I'm much more less likely to be re-elected by the same people in those particular areas. That's why it is much more likely for me to actually stay and go to my train rides and go to particular places in order for me to do my job, right? Okay, and talk about like how like Op tries to talk about incentives, apparently because they want to be re-elected, then that's enough an incentive. We think that this isn't enough, because the comparative here is that when these people actually go to the daily lives of usual salarymen, that actually takes your public transport, then this is where there is an actual incentive for them to care. Why? Because number one, they're using it themselves, right? It's human nature. You will always be a little bit selfish. If I'm being affected by it, then hence I would definitely care more, right? And also their relatives are also using it. So that means there is some kind of a much more incentive for them to care, because your kids are coming back and complaining about how this syllabus is really
shitty, right? Or how you'll be much more emotionally invested to care about your child's own well-being because you want the best for your child. And this kind of benefit will like transcend not only to your child but the children of the country as a whole. And we think that this is much more better under our side. We can utilize this particular aspect of human nature in which like a parent cares more about the particular child, and like that child's needs is also pretty similar to the needs of the particular people of that country. And we think that this is better under our side, right? And they talk about how there is no principal obligation, how we don't force your normal citizens to do it because like to choose a particular form of like services. Look, what Op is missing out here is the kind of characterization that Shirley has already told you, that the difference between your politicians and your normal citizens, that your politicians are people who have consented to prioritize the needs of these particular people, and that it is sort of like an altruistic career in which this is the kind of nature that it should have been in. And if this is a part of the job, and then that the ability for them to improve and this is how this improves their ability to do their job, and that's why it is justified for them to even do this in the first place. And how they talk about, they'll only use your infrastructure in urban areas, right? Look, we think that Op thinks that apparently all your politicians are in your Kuala Lumpur and your Putrajaya, but we think this isn't true, especially when we're talking about like your MPs are like scattered all over the place in the first place. And we think that your MPs are everywhere because they'll stay in that area because they want to do their job, and second, that they want to be liked, and like they want these people to vote for them even more after this. So that's why they'll probably like stay there, right? And it's harder, and they say that it's harder for the public to claim that politicians aren't doing anything. Look, we think that this isn't true because number one, not all of these services are even good in the first place. That's why these people need to go